Picture a woman in Berlin, pushing a wheelbarrow piled with paper marks, just to buy one single loaf of bread. She sets it down for a moment. When she turns back, the thief has dumped every note onto the cobblestones. He's run off with the empty wheelbarrow instead, leaving the fortune behind. That's not a punchline. That's Germany, late 1923. The wheelbarrow itself was worth more than the entire fortune sitting inside it. How does money break that badly? Rewind 4 years. Germany had just lost the First World War, its armies broken, its people humiliated and starving. The peace treaty of Versailles handed Germany a bill so staggering it would take generations to ever repay. 132 billion gold marks in reparations, plus the shame of signing a humiliating war guilt clause. The new Weimar government faced an impossible choice: tax a broken, resentful population, or simply print more money. They chose the printing presses. And once those presses started rolling, no one in Berlin could make them stop. At first, the damage crept in slowly. A cup of coffee costing 1 mark in 1919 cost 5 by 1921. Uncomfortable, but survivable. People grumbled, tightened their belts, and adjusted, believing the worst had already passed them by. Then, in January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched straight into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, to seize coal. Berlin's answer was passive resistance. Workers went on strike, and the government kept paying their wages with money it lacked. The presses roared louder to cover it. By summer, the mark wasn't just falling anymore. It was in free fall. Prices doubled in days, then in hours. Waiters raced between tables, rewriting menu prices while customers were still eating. Factories began paying workers twice a day, at lunch and at closing, because even hours meant real, measurable loss. Wives met husbands at the factory gate, ready to sprint the cash straight to market before its value withered. You didn't save money in 1923 Germany. You spent it the instant it touched your hand, out of pure fear. Tomorrow, that same handful of bills might buy only half as much bread. Waiting even an hour was ruin. By November, a single American dollar bought over 4 trillion German marks. The number itself barely meant anything anymore. A loaf of bread costing around 250 marks in early 1923 cost some 200 billion marks by that December. Banknotes were printed on one side only to save time, in denominations reaching 100 trillion marks each. The numbers grew so large that ordinary people simply stopped trying to count them at all and gave up entirely. The government hired private printing firms nationwide, over 130 factories churning out paper money around the clock. For an entire generation of savers, this was ruin. 40 years of careful saving turned worthless in a single season. Widows who had lived off war bond payouts found themselves destitute almost overnight, their promised security simply gone. Meanwhile, some people quietly got richer. Anyone holding debt in old marks could pay it off with worthless paper. Farmers with land and grain had leverage nobody else possessed, hoarding harvests rather than sell for crumbling currency. Money became cheaper than the paper it was printed on, literally, and families began burning banknotes for heat. Firewood had simply grown too expensive, while stacks of cash sat useless in every drawer and cupboard nearby. Children stacked bundles of bills like toy blocks in the street, never grasping that this paper was once a fortune. Barter crept back into daily life. A doctor might be paid in eggs, a tailor paid instead in coal. A music lesson might be traded for potatoes. Trust in paper money had simply evaporated from ordinary daily life. Crime and desperation rose together. Bread riots broke out in cities, hunger turning neighbors against one another overnight. Shopkeepers hid their goods, rather than sell for cash that would be worthless by the time it reached the bank. In the middle of all this humiliation and hunger, extremist voices found an audience they had never had before. In November 1923, a little-known agitator named Adolf Hitler tried to seize power in a Munich beer hall. He bet that a desperate nation was ready to gamble on anyone offering certainty, however dangerous that certainty truly was. That putsch failed within a day and landed him briefly in prison, but the anger it fed on never vanished. It simply waited, buried in the bitterness of families who had lost everything to worthless paper and empty promises. The hyperinflation itself ended almost as suddenly as it began, once new leadership finally confronted the runaway printing presses. A new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by land and industry instead of gold, was introduced that same November. The printing presses finally slowed, and within weeks, prices stabilized. On paper, at least, the crisis was over. But something quieter had broken, something no currency reform could ever truly fix within a wounded, exhausted nation. An entire society had learned, in the span of one single year, that money could become worthless before the ink even dried. That lesson didn't fade when the Rentenmark arrived. It lived on in fear, bitterness, and a hunger for certainty. A hunger for anyone who promised this ruin could never, ever happen to them again in their lifetime. Ask yourself, what would you do differently if you knew the cash in your wallet might be worthless by dinner? Somewhere, in a quiet ledger, that same fragile question is still waiting to be asked of us all today. If stories where money, fear, and power topple nations pull you in, stay close. This channel lives for exactly these moments.